and welcome to BOF Voices 2024, the Business of Fashion's annual gathering for big thinkers. I'm Imran Ahmed, founder and CEO of the Business of Fashion. To everyone watching online, hello. Let us know where in the world you're joining from today. And to everyone here with us in Oxfordshire, it's a pleasure to have you with us. As our team and longtime attendees know, Voices is my favorite time of the year because it's where BOF's mission to open, inform, and connect the global fashion industry really comes to life. But this year feels different. 9 years after launching Voices, I can't think of a time that feels as critical for the global fashion industry as the moment we find ourselves in now. A variety of forces are confronting us all at once. This year, Voices takes place in the wake of one of the most polarizing and divisive elections in US history. The world is still processing the impact of Donald Trump's imminent return to the White House, which will have far-reaching implications for everyone, everywhere. Meanwhile, we are still hurtling towards the point of no return amid the global climate crisis. There's the ongoing shift towards a multipolar world as Western supremacy wanes. Seemingly intractable wars are still raging in the Middle East and Ukraine, and human rights and free speech are under threat, even in democratic countries. And then there is the potential impact of artificial intelligence on just about everything. Yet, not much has changed in terms of how we are operating as an industry. We go about doing our work, keeping our businesses afloat on old models and antiquated ways of thinking. I think we're losing sight of the bigger picture. Our industry is so vitally important to everyday life, work, and business all around the globe. But right now, it feels like we are on the verge of some kind of cataclysmic upheaval for which we are inadequately prepared. That's why we created BOF Voices. Our goal has always been to unite brilliant minds across different disciplines through well-rounded discourse. It's through these discussions that we can understand how these political, cultural, technological, and economic forces are shaping the world around us. If you've joined us before, you already know that this is not your traditional fashion conference, where fashion people speak to fashion people about fashion. Over the next few days, we will be diving into all of the topics you need to understand as we look ahead to 2025. We've gathered an extraordinary mix of creative visionaries, business leaders, forward-thinking entrepreneurs, and activists. They are all here to share their expertise, their experiences, and their insights as we look to the turbulent year ahead. Here in Oxfordshire, we also have an extraordinary cohort of attendees hailing from more than 25 countries. 34% of you work in fashion, but we also have plenty of attendees from the worlds of advertising, retail, education, entertainment, media, and fine art. I also want to extend a very special welcome to thousands of BOF professional members tuning in on our global live stream from more than 100 countries around the world. But whether you're joining us in person or remotely, remember to share your feedback and join in our global conversation using the hashtag BOF Voices. Finally, none of what we're doing here would be possible without our partners, so a big thank you to Shop with Google, Amazon Fashion, McKinsey & Company, and Certiloco, who've helped to make BOF Voices 2024 possible. As is the Voices tradition, our program takes place over 5 carefully curated content sessions. Tomorrow, in session 2, we'll go inside the fashion system, examining the implosion of the luxury e-commerce sector, the impact of extreme heat on fashion manufacturing, and the burgeoning potential of the luxury market in India. Plus, we'll meet one of the industry's most talked about entrepreneurs and designers, Simon Porte-Jacquemus. In session 3, on technology and innovation, we'll learn how AI is being used to improve product discovery and tackle overproduction in fashion. we'll hear from a multimedia artist and neuroscientist to experience the power of music as medicine. In session 4 on global culture and creativity, we'll meet a breakout Pakistani painter, learn from top business leaders at Skims and On who are leveraging culture to disrupt the sportswear and shapeswear markets. We'll go inside the creative process at Italian luxury house Valentino in the first ever joint talk with creative director Alessandro Micheli and CEO Jacopo Venturini. Finally, in Live Your Best Life, we'll meet France's most famous drag queen, social media's most talked about couple, and inspiring people who have overcome the odds to lead purposeful and meaningful lives. But as always, we kick things off this evening with an immersion into the wider world. And what a world it is. Over the past 12 months, the word era, propelled by Taylor Swift's blockbuster tour, has become somewhat ubiquitous. But as our opening speaker will explain, we really are on the cusp of a new era, as demographic, technological, and geopolitical forces propel us into a new chapter of world history. Sven Smith is the chairman of the McKinsey Global Institute. He is here to provide big picture insights, which will really set the scene for so many of the discussions that we'll be having over the next few days. Please join me in welcoming Sven Smith.
Thank you, Ina. Thank you. It's a privilege to be a voice at Voices. You'll not see dresses from me or any other form of fashion. I will just zoom out and talk about a big picture. I'm looking around the room here, and I'll make a bet based on your color of hair, the grayness, the wrinkles in your skin, and so on, that none of you is old enough to have been in a moment like this. A moment in which we do an era shift, and one that's not a casual one, but the one that also has to do with geopolitics and supply chain issues. I was 6 years old when that happened, and I was roller skating on the highways of the Netherlands, as my parents were not allowed to drive on Sundays to conserve oil. This was 1972. This is the last time that the world shifted in a new era, while we were also short all kinds of materials. And geopolitics is much less about religion or form of government. Geopolitics is about safety, militarily and bodily safety, as well as stuff. If every city in the world would have had enough stuff, we would just be fighting over soccer, basketball, or something like that. But since we're short in one place and the other, we need to ship stuff around, and that's why we're fighting. And all the fights that are happening right now could also be interpreted through that lens. Does any one of you still remember your holiday? Was it good? A long time ago, eh? But I just want to remind you that something that is called the fear index, which measures how much fear is priced in August moved to about 60. As big as COVID, as big as the financial crisis. What happened in August? Well, in August, basically, Japan moved the interest rate by 0.15%. And that scared everyone. And then Japan stopped it, and the scare went away. But in a shift to a new era, wild things are happening. Here's a history of eras that we think is probably true since the Second World War. There was a post-war boom, which is decolonizing, there was engineering, we started to get suburban life, we had great amounts of energy, and the economics were good. It was one of rebuilding. Then we had the era of contention, which started in the 70s with the oil crisis. And basically, we got Cold War peaks and everything else that we feel now in geopolitics. We actually had the time of consumer electronics. And basically, the trends were different, and we had oil crisis, and actually, money was no longer cheap. And then we had the period, the era of markets, even the global markets, that you probably all have lived through as leaders or students or whatever walk of life you've been at in that period, which is good. We collaborate. China makes everything cheap. Asia makes everything cheap, so no inflation. We are basically connecting digitally. We are actually starting to stabilize demographics. All good. You know, we actually have enough energy. We start to get concerned about the climate. And we had cheap money. Does anyone want to guess which one of these 5 is still true? None. At least that's if you believe the press. I would say there's something still true, and I hope to convince you of that. This is the roller coaster of the 70s. So you see on the left, the 70s. We're sort of in 76 now. The inflation has come down one time. But there was another one, because we didn't fix the supply. It took us till 85 to pump enough oil and gas at that time to actually get back control over the price as we shifted from a 50% OPEC dependency to a 30% OPEC dependency. Today, in many products, we are 80% dependent of certain countries, whether it be a country in Africa, be it Chile, be it China, and so on. These dependencies stimulate geopolitics. We will have to fix supply to the world. There is enough, but we need to build it so that we can make what people need. This is where politicians are now proud. We got inflation under control. It's back down. There are lots of definitions in inflation. The ones that get picked are the lowest. But the reality is, the consumers feel the pain of the cumulative inflation, the surface underneath this mountain. The cumulative inflation for an average Western country is 20%. Only China was at 6%, which means that the average consumer got 20% poorer. And until they get their money back, they will be angry. You can't just say inflation is 3%, it's fine. No, they lost 20%. And if you live at the bottom 40%, that is more like 35% because essential goods are more important to you. So we have to think about how to make stuff affordable if you want to be able to satisfy customers that basically got poorer. China is calming down a little bit, although as people say China might only go 2 or 3%. I just want to say 2 to 3% growth, even if they don't hit their 4 to 5, is still more growth than the rest of Asia combined. So don't forget it, it's a big market, and there's of course all kinds of tension. I'm going to guess this is probably the most unexpected slide that you see. On the right-hand side, I have a microscope, and on the left-hand side, a telescope. And it's a bit about the CEO agenda. And something has happened. I've talked to about 500 CEOs every year. And what has really happened is that the agenda has completely changed. Usually, you were a fashion company, you had fashion issues, a bank with bank issues, a beer company with beer issues. And you had one more global issue. So you added global warming or circularity or COVID or Ukraine as one more issue that you had to think about that we were all thinking about. This year, for example, in Davos, people make lists of issues. Do I have all the geopolitical issues? Do I have all the supply chain conflicts? Do I have the interest rate implications, the shortages in labor? Do I understand AI? And the CEOs, besides their short list of own issues, had 30 issues. And I notice it when I talk to people in general, not just CEOs, they're shifting their mind from what just happened to interpret one of the 30 issues. That's a characteristic of when you enter a new era. Because in a new era, everything is changing a little bit, and you try to figure out what's right and what's wrong and where we're heading. But as we get tired in the microscope, I would say, because it's a long list and some really complicated and painful things, we forget the telescope. In the telescope, I will contend the future is bright. And by the way, billions and trillions worth of money are invested in that bright future. There is enough stuff in the ground to satisfy 20 billion, we're not going to have 20 billion people, but 20 billion people at the wealth of, let's say, Amsterdam. We just need to dig it up. It's hard work, takes time, but there's enough stuff. That's not the planetary boundary. AI, let's imagine it in a different way than the software in your phone, but imagine it as a humanoid robot behind every person, one. It's entirely possible. They will cost 20 to 30K. They will have roughly your brain as intelligence, at least. And basically, that would double, triple, quadruple our output per person, which means that the 4.8 billion people that are poor in the world actually could live like the people in Amsterdam. Then you might have say energy, climate. We will solve energy and climate because we actually need to. At the moment, energy has become a security issue, more almost than a climate issue, although it's of course both. But basically, AI is security. AI eats energy. And you start to see people doing things that we couldn't discuss for 10 years. So many tech players have basically bought into nuclear, from buying 3 Mile Island to other things, which is a very different narrative about what we're going to do. So that means that we will have enough energy. It'll take time, and the transition is painful, but we will have enough energy, don't worry. If you just think the sun, we only use 0.1% of what the sun sends us. We just need to ratchet it up a little bit, and we're fine. In the meantime, we'll do nuclear, we'll do other things. In the short term, we'll still do fossil fuels. We'll have enough energy. And then the advances in science are just enormous. I have synthesized it in the following way as a little stories. I believe my daughter, age 15, has about an 80% chance to make it to 120, and a 1/3 chance to make it to 150. And that's before AI started thinking about it. So the last one, the 150, is speculative, but the 120 could actually be in the money. And we can debate 110, but basically the progress in science is going to be enormous, and AI hasn't been thinking yet. So we should not forget, as we get tired in the microscope, that the telescope is just going to be great. And I think that one of the most undertold stories is the human potential. And as a result, we come into limit mindsets of where the world could be going instead of doing impossible things. You all saw the rocket landing and being grabbed. I won't call the name because he's political at the moment, but Elon. I got a course when I was young, a mechanical engineer, that it was impossible to land the rocket. It was just too unstable to take something that comes down at twice the speed of sound, break it, put the fire under, and then hold it. Impossible. Technically, will never be possible. It happened. It happened. And many more things happened in that same way with robot taxis and so on. So I don't know whether you saw that. How was your week? But it was the 6 things that were launched in the Elon's universe, from robot taxis to the humanoid robots tapping beer and all that kind of stuff. The innovation potential of the world is enormous, but we have to deal with some of these short-term issues too. So when you would read the world about globalization, we basically have said we'll end globalization. This page summarizes a 300-page report in 1 page. And basically, red means you're dependent, blue is you're free. Okay, you look down the columns. Not a single region is independent. No region will be an island. We will not deglobalize, because then the world will not work. We might go more regional, we might go more bilateral, and I actually think this is good news. Because if you're dependent, you shoot much less than if you're independent. So this actually is a peacemaker. Because you will consider 3 times to shoot at somebody that is actually bringing your essential energy or your essential materials. So no region is going to be an island. So while this is shifting, the world is not going to go local. It cannot. AI is big. I like this one, but there's a million ways that you could think about AI. This is the progression from GPT to GPT-4 with vision, on which exams they can make. GPT next year will be able to do all the exams at PhD level. Just get ready. Yeah? So just think about it. Just get ready. It might have, I think, it felt very fast and then very slow, but it is very fast. I just want to add it. So, just think about it. Agents will basically do your PhD. That would be good. It's democratizing PhDs. I actually like it. Energy is very important. Yeah, we already had energy issues before AI said, I'm hungry for energy. But we did something in the last 20 years, which was we grew the energy investments by 7.7% until 2014. And then we said, let's not do it. How did we do that? We reduced growth in renewables, and we reduced growth in oil and gas. Actually, we went negative on the investment levels in oil and gas, as you see the black line coming down. To maintain energy balance, that 0.5% should be north of 10%. We need to have catch-up investment in energy. Energy makes the world go round. More energy is good, because it will bring food, product, and everything to society. We'll have to make it clean. But we need to be careful that we don't make it impossible for people to deal with. I believe the energy transition will be reframed into a quadrilemma. And it's already happening. Now, I've been talking about this for more than a decade, but you basically were in a frame transition at any cost. And then we learned, this is maybe the only good lesson from the Ukraine event, when Ukraine basically made it expensive to have energy, unreliable to have energy, we basically, let's call it punched in the face, and learned that you cannot make energy so expensive because the people at the bottom actually don't survive properly. In my country, in the Netherlands, if the energy gets expensive, the bottom of the Netherlands starts food optimizing. That's how the richest country is still poor. So we have to do this transition in an affordable way. Second thing is you can't just do an energy transition where you can't count on energy. So that's why the new data centers, they actually require to be put in a place where energy is secure, because they can't shut down. And wind and solar are not always secure, so you can't only bet on that card. We will have to do something richer. And then for Europe, it's important that when the US did the IRA, the US can get the title wrong and the policy right. That might be IRA, because of course it was not inflation reducing. It can get the title right and the policy wrong. But both I've not seen before that they would actually get both right. But basically, the IRA was hitting us in the competitiveness, and it has hurt us. Because basically the regulation in Europe is a mandate to do something, while in the US it's a subsidy to do something, to get innovation. So you get a carrot for innovation and a mandate that leads to cost. It's wrong. As a result, Europe has problems with its competitiveness that Draghi in his report has laid. We invest half the R&D, we invest much less in capex, our companies are smaller, more fragmented and so on. And Draghi rightfully said we need radical, radical, radical change. If the other people don't play by the rules, we can't be playing by the rules. Europe is relatively a little handicapped on the dependency. If you're a little handicapped, you can't be more papal than the Pope, or more Catholic than the Pope. I don't know what that expression is. And I just want to take two more lenses, and then I will round off what I think this era is going to be. If you look at the demographics, one way to look at it is, where are the babies coming from? Well, India, yes. China, even though with the one-child policy, and you see Nigeria. But of course, if you add up Africa, and particularly sub-Saharan, that's where they come from. But in this context, I want to warn you for something that we don't talk enough about. We've been talking about aging for decades, but in the wrong way. We looked on the right-hand side, which is we're getting older. That's fine if we get healthier. The fertility rate dropping below replacement rate will be the problem of the next century. The problem is it takes time until it hits you, but it's not stable for a society to be at 1.4. The panic in Korea, where it's now 0.7, is complete. And so we will have to actually figure out that we tell a positive story in which our children actually would want to have children. And part of their story, why they don't take them, is because we don't tell the story of the telescope. And if I look back in 50 years, I would hope that the name of the next era would include these four things. We still have markets, we still have cross-border flows, we collaborate, we probably are we have geopolitical and political, we're automated, but the most important thing is we have enough stuff, lots of things that we can do with robots and energy and longevity. We will go for abundance. It's time for a positive story of the future. Thank you.
That was a very positive way to open. Those of you who've come here before know that sometimes we start with a bit of doom and gloom. But just to say, with all of the heavy things happening, let's keep in mind the telescope. I'm going to get back to the microscope now. 1 week ago today, Americans went to the polls and elected Donald Trump, the 49th president of the United States. In the days since Trump was elected, there has been much hand-wringing about the future of American democracy. But Trump's return to the White House has also raised questions on how his new policy agenda will impact global business, the implications his foreign policy will have on Ukraine, the Middle East, and Taiwan, and what his plans are for important global climate change initiatives. Thankfully, Ravi Agrawal will provide some answers to help us map a way forward. He is the award-winning editor-in-chief of Foreign Policy. Before that, Ravi worked at CNN for more than a decade across 3 continents, covering economics, foreign policy, and breaking news. As Ravi is very busy in the aftermath of the election, he is joining us today remotely from New York City with some real-time insights on what the return of Donald Trump means for the world. Please join me in welcoming Ravi Agrawal.
Imran, thanks so much for having me. I apologize for not being able to join in person. I have to say, though, it means I have to worry a little bit less about how fashionable I look. So you're just going to have to believe that I'm wearing some very chic shoes. I'm here to talk about what Trump's return means for the world. And I thought I'd just start very quickly with why he won. We'll have all kinds of postmortems in the coming months, but there are a couple of global reasons that are worth thinking about because this didn't happen in a vacuum. First, Harris tied herself very closely to Biden. And the reality, if you take a macro look at the world, is that it's been a very hard year for incumbent candidates everywhere. In just the last couple of years, you could look at Austria, Australia, Finland, France, India, Italy, Sweden, South Korea, Slovenia, Poland, Portugal, New Zealand, and the UK, where you are. And each of these countries have either seen a change in government or a sharply reduced mandate for the government in power. Some of this is because the pandemic led to a surge in government spending, which led to inflation, which led to higher costs for bread and milk. And I know this sounds simplistic, but pocketbook economics is what affects most people. COVID had an impact. Second, immigration. We're in a world that is seeing a profound backlash to around 4 decades of globalization and opening up, in addition to the forces of urbanization, technology, and unfettered capitalism. This is not just America, it's global. So if the people are telling you that they are unhappy with your immigration policy, you will lose. This is something that the right, I think, has understood and deployed as a strategy around the world. This isn't to say that Harris was doomed from the start. She wasn't. She could have won. But she had important global headwinds. And there are many more domestic reasons for why Trump won and why Harris lost. But I just wanted to quickly connect those global dots for you on the US election, no matter where you're from. The bigger question to look at now, and the reason why I'm with you today, is to look at what Trump might do for the world. So, broad strokes, Biden and Harris cared about alliances and democracy promotion. We know that. Trump cares more about bilateral relations. He's transactional. You will keep hearing that word, transactional. He likes to say that he got a better deal. And it follows then that unlike Biden and Harris, Trump doesn't care so much about alliances, about rules and norms that have underpinned the world since World War II. So what does that mean in practice? And there are 3 main areas where Trump will change the Biden-Harris trajectory. First, tariffs. Trump loves tariffs. He said he's going to put a 20% tariff on imports from all countries and a 100% tariff on goods from China, 200% if it's electronic vehicles. Now, tariffs are basically a tax on imported goods. Countries and companies, and they've said this, will pass those taxes on to consumers. So it's a fair bet to say that if Trump goes ahead with his stated tariff policy, you will get potentially drastic inflation in the United States and globally as well. You will certainly get instability. You will see supply chains getting stretched. But here's the thing. A, companies and countries are beginning to prepare for that. B, we don't know whether Trump is actually going to do it, and even if he does, to what degree. So what can I tell you that's new? My bet is that Trump closely watches the stock markets, even though that's not a real indicator for the economy. But he watches it. He watches the bond markets. And the minute you get panic there, he will likely reassess what he wants to do. Trump is a learning machine. But this is a big thing for all of you to watch out for globally, tariffs. Second, deportations. This is a big deal. I mentioned immigration earlier as a force that every country on earth is facing at some level. Well, Trump knows this, and he has repeatedly said that he will deport several million illegal immigrants currently in the United States. In a sense, he has a mandate to do so. And there are 3 problems here. Who does the work these workers are currently doing, whether it's in fashion, whether it's in the entertainment industry or the hotel industry or restaurants? Where do these people go? And what happens to the countries they are sent to? And lastly, what about the immense humanitarian consequences? These are all questions all of us will have to track very closely in 2025. Trump has already named his border czar, a former police officer named Tom Homan, and you can expect Trump's bark on this one to be just as bad as his bite. So third, climate change. There is every chance that Trump will pull the United States back out of the Paris Climate Accords, just as he did in 2017. Except, unlike last time, I actually don't think this will hurt as much, in part because it won't be a surprise to anyone. The bigger thing to watch out for is whether Trump is going to roll back some of the Biden administration's clean energy subsidies. So if the incentives around clean energy production change, then you might imagine that major companies will shift their policies, and that could in turn have immense consequences for a range of green initiatives around the world. Two more things. What about global conflicts? Let's go there. Ukraine. Europe is extremely worried. Now, here's the thing. I was in Kyiv recently, and the Ukrainians are actually upset with the Biden administration. They think Biden was slow rolling aid to Ukraine. They think he was giving them enough to survive, but not enough to win. No matter who won the US election, something was going to change on this front. And that's in part because Russia's president, Putin, was waiting to see who would win, and therefore how he would game out his next steps. So the likely scenario is that Trump is going to try and encourage a deal that freezes the conflict at its current territory share. So Russia gets to keep what it has, Ukraine has to deal with it. And this is in part because America would give Ukraine less aid, less military hardware, as all of Trump's advisors have been saying for many months now. And this is why Europe is upset about the return of Trump. One open question is whether Ukraine still gets to join NATO. Watch out for that. Last one, the Middle East. There is actually, surprisingly, less divergence here between Trump and Biden or Harris. The United States was already, as you all know, backing Israel to a great degree. That support will get stronger now. Trump is not going to shed tears over humanitarian concerns in Gaza or Lebanon unless he really surprises us. One thing to watch out for here is how Trump will handle Iran. If you listen to the people in his orbit, the options being discussed range from bombing Iran's nuclear facilities, either with American assistance directly or giving Israel the means to do so. Or there's another strain of thinking in Trump world that the United States needs to stay out of military entanglements abroad. Remember, American voters also are very keen for the United States to spend less blood, sweat, and tears in countries they can't name. So there's a lot of variance, I think, here on what Trump might do, but in reality, not that far off from the choices that Biden had and that Harris would have had. Lastly, I want to zoom out for a minute because we can often get mired in these two global wars when we talk about them. What do the world's leaders think about everything I've just laid out? And when I speak with diplomats and foreign ministers around the world, it's obvious to me that if you're anywhere in Europe, you're terrified of Trump. So if the old order, the post-Bretton Woods order in which alliances mattered, and the head of the IMF was always European, and the head of the World Bank was always American, if that old order was good for you, then the idea of a US president who shakes things up and doesn't care as much about alliances, that is scary. And that's why leaders from Berlin to Brussels seem as worried as they currently are. On the other hand, if you are in parts of Asia or Africa, the world looks quite different right now. China's your biggest trading partner, not the United States. You see the rules-based liberal international order as actually quite unequal and unfair. You are tired of America lecturing you about human rights and democracy. And you look at someone like President-elect Trump, who is nakedly transactional, and your response is actually, wait a minute, I like this. I want transactional. I want deals. So if you're Kenya or India or Indonesia, you actually want to do business, just as you do with the Chinese, without a lecture about democracy. So at the international level, Trump is going to bring turmoil, especially on trade and on global alliances and on norms. But some countries want this and some don't. And that brings me to my final point. Over the last 4 years, every time Biden administration leaders have gone abroad to talk about their policies, they're often just asked one question. Okay, but what happens if Trump comes back? In other words, was Trump a blip? We now know that he wasn't. And it may be that Biden was the blip. Time will tell. But what is clear to me is that the Obama, Clinton, Biden era of neoliberalism and a faith in capitalism and the markets benefiting everyone equally, the people seem to have rejected that. It isn't working. The system isn't working for everyone equally. And so that old order needs to rethink its viability. But remember that Trumpism too can't last forever. Trump will only get 4 years, we think. But a lot about the future depends on how regular American politicians now interpret the reason why Americans voted as they did and respond to it. I will stop there. Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you very much, Ravi. Next year, you'll be here in person, hopefully.
I'd love to.
One of the key findings in the State of Fashion 2025 report is that sustainability has fallen down the CEO agenda. Only 18% of fashion executives we surveyed cite sustainability as a top 3 risk for growth in 2025. This is down from 29% in 2024. Our next speaker is here to call industry leaders to action. 25-year-old Clover Hogan is a climate activist and the founder of Force of Nature, a youth nonprofit turning climate anxiety into action. Clover is used to challenging global leaders to act. She has worked alongside authorities on sustainability, consulted with the boardrooms of Fortune 50 companies, and even counseled heads of state. She is here at Voices with an important question. How do we as an industry reconcile our constant drive for growth and consumption with the urgent need to reduce climate impact? Please welcome Clover Hogan.
So, I first learned about the climate crisis at the age of 11 through documentaries. And I remember sitting glued to my computer screen, staring at scenes of million-year-old forests being bulldozed to produce Big Macs. Countries disappearing beneath rising seas, and islands of plastic taking their place. Mountains of waste sent from rich countries to the poor, who were left to pick through the scraps of our consumption. I remember feeling heartbroken and angry at the sheer injustice of it all. But I also remember feeling really confused. I didn't learn about the climate crisis in school. I didn't see it on TV when my parents watched the news. We didn't talk about it at the dinner table. It was as if the adults in my life were sleepwalking, even as the science showed us it was toward a cliff of climate collapse. Now, back then, I thought the only explanation is that people just don't know, and if enough people understand what's happening, they'll be compelled to act. So, I declared to my parents over dinner one night that I wanted to become an activist, and I made it my mission to sound the alarm. Now, skip forward 14 years, and climate awareness is the highest it has ever been. Yet in many ways, we're in a worse off position. Today, the richest 26 people own as much wealth as the poorest 3.8 billion. 80% of the world's original forests are gone, and 1 million species are on the brink of extinction. And we have just 6 years left to halve global emissions and avoid irreversible climate collapse. To quote the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres, "We are on a highway to climate hell with our foot still on the accelerator." Ignorance is no longer an excuse. But what I didn't realize at the age of 11 was that many people in our society are content to continue with business as usual. Indeed, the human capacity for denial is quite extraordinary. In the wake of the 2015 Paris Agreement, many countries and companies have not only stagnated on their climate commitments, but actively reversed them. A 2023 study found that 58% of the world's major corporations have put forward climate commitments that are in direct opposition to their own lobbying. Meanwhile, Deloitte surveyed business leaders on what they perceived to be the #1 benefit of taking action on sustainability. It wasn't, in fact, addressing the climate crisis, but public perception. We've seen this plainly with the rise of greenwashing, that many companies and brands are more concerned to be seen doing the right thing than to actually do it. According to a research summary from Zippia, 58% of companies worldwide are actively greenwashing, and this number jumps to 72% in North America. Now, do we want to guess which industry is the worst offender? Fashion. It started out as brands co-opting sustainable language and imagery, like H&M's Conscious collection. Yet it has evolved into an arsenal of tactics. There's green shifting, which places the blame or responsibility on the consumer. It was, of course, BP who created the carbon footprint calculator, an ingenious way to shine the spotlight of accountability away from themselves and onto everyday people. Examples from the fashion industry include brands encouraging people to make responsible choices, or recycling initiatives which simply place the onus on individuals to tackle waste. In the case of most fast fashion outlets, H&M, Zara, Shein, Primark, Uniqlo, it would take over a decade for them to recycle what they sell in a matter of days. Now, there's also green lighting, highlighting the good to distract us from the bad. From brands launching sustainable collections without slowing down production of their regular lines, through to green collaborations with celebrities, influencers, or organizations known for their green credentials. There is also woke washing. A brand may change their logo to the LGBT flag during Pride Month, or feature a diversity of faces in their latest ad campaign, while failing to interrogate who makes their products or the conditions that they're working under. Of the 75 million factory workers currently employed by fast fashion, it's estimated that less than 2% make a living wage. Many of them are children, working up to 16-hour days, 7 days a week. Now, you might be thinking, well, the luxury sector is better. Yet just this year, investigators in Italy linked brands like Dior and Armani operating sweatshops on the outskirts of Milan. When brands employ some of these tactics that I've spoken to, of course, there's the risk that they will receive backlash, but there are greater societal repercussions too. The illusion of progress lulls us into a false sense of complacency by elevating superficial solutions while companies can continue with business as usual. If there is one thing I've learned in over a decade of climate activism, it's that we have the money, the technology, the resources to solve this crisis. Yet this challenge is ultimately not a logistical one. It's a cultural one. This crisis is the product of decisions made every day by world leaders, people working in business, in the media, and of course, by citizens. And these decisions are shaped by the narratives that we subscribe to collectively. First, there is the narrative of growth. The idea that firms, industries, and nations must increase their production every year, regardless of whether it is needed. I'm sure many of you are familiar with Earth Overshoot Day, which marks the date when our demand for ecological resources in a given year exceeds what the Earth can regenerate. Now, if we take my home country of Australia, if everyone lived the way that Australians do, we would have consumed all of the planet's resources just a third of the way into the year. Again, if we look at fashion, due to the drive for growth, this industry generates 100 billion items every year, 85% of which end up in a landfill or incinerated. There are currently enough garments today to clothe the next 6 generations of people. That is, to put it lightly, insanity. Then there is the narrative of consumption, the idea that we can buy our way out of this crisis. Now, we have all been subject to consumerism, whether it's buying new clothes or makeup or upgrading to the latest iPhone. And most consumer-facing companies have built their entire business model on convincing us to buy more stuff. In 2023, ad spending globally went up to $733 billion US. This industry shapes what we think about. It decides what is aspirational. It manufactures our desires. It compels our behavior. So, I'm sure many of you can anticipate the flaws in the concept of sustainable consumerism. Whether it's a shoe brand inserting recycled plastic into yet another product, or oil and gas companies encouraging people to be more energy efficient. Our focus cannot be on making tweaks that marginally improve a product's impact. It must be on reducing production and consumption. If I put it simply, if the bathtub is overflowing, your first instinct shouldn't be to grab a mop, it should be to turn off the tap. So, what is the alternative to unfettered growth, to consumerism above all else? We need to move from an extractive economy to a regenerative one in order to sustain the natural basis of life and put well-being ahead of profit. We must design societies that do not have consumption at the heart, but connection. And within business, this can look like a few things. Shifting from an approach of do less harm to do more good. Not just limiting consequences and the bad stuff, but actively restoring nature and communities. It means embracing services or models that enable us not just to grow in volume, but of course in value. And it means moving the goalposts of business from creating a product or a service in pursuit of profit to creating a product or service that is a vehicle for solving social and environmental problems. So how might this translate to fashion? At a textile level, we can use materials that at a base are recycled or grown regeneratively, like Allbirds zero carbon shoes, which use merino wool that sequesters more carbon than it emits. With the product, we can design for longevity, repairability, and recyclability, otherwise known as slow fashion. If we take Houdini, a Swedish brand, their flagship jacket is worn an average of 1,287 times. Or Patagonia, which has created an in-house second-hand platform. And at the business level, we need to innovate better models that embrace rental, resale, and subscription services, which reduce the emphasis on individual ownership. And of course, we need equity and social justice at the heart of this industry, and that includes the obvious stuff, like fair labor practices and ensuring safe working conditions at every stage of production with total transparency across supply chains. Yeah, I'm sure at this point in the talk, you have cottoned on to the fact that none of these solutions are sufficient in isolation. No amount of tech-based innovation is going to get us out of this mess. There's a great quote. Insanity is doing the same thing over and over and expecting a different outcome. This is true of the moment we're in now. We can't skirt around the problems or uphold token solutions and expect a different outcome. We need solutions that are holistic, that are intersectional, and that are systemic in their nature. This includes moving subsidies from destructive industries into sustainable ones, and advocating for regulation that doesn't just incentivize good behavior, but forces the entire industry to move. One such example comes from France. In 2020, they passed an anti-waste law, prohibiting the destruction of unsold clothing and mandating that brands provide information on their impact. The EU has also led the way with extended producer responsibility policies, which require that producers take ownership of the collection, the sorting, and the recirculation of their products when discarded. This means that brands will finally have to pay for the cost of their pollution. And with financial penalties in place, it will no longer make economic sense for brands to embrace this throwaway culture. Also on the horizon is a digital product passport to ensure transparency in a product's entire life cycle. Change is happening, and it's made possible by the collaboration of diverse stakeholders: activists, brands, industry workers, policymakers, and NGOs. And these are just a handful of the NGOs leading the way. FibreShed develops fibers that improve soil health through regenerative farming. Fashion Revolution campaigns for a clean, transparent, and accountable fashion industry. Fairwear Foundation is lobbying the garment industry to support workers and ensure their rights to safe, dignified, and properly paid employment. And a personal favorite, the Orr Foundation in Ghana. They're working with local communities to develop sustainable enterprises that repurpose textile waste and run global campaigns such as Stop Waste Colonialism. Now, I could keep going because there are countless examples of inspiration, activists, and disruptors from outside of the industry. But while I think progress is inevitable, the question still stands of whether it will happen fast enough. Because we need disruptors not just on the outside, but in rooms like this one. As a civilization, we are at a tipping point. And in the face of the climate crisis, it is easy to feel overwhelmed, to feel powerless, and to question, well, I'm just one person, what can I do? Yet inaction is no longer an option. For the billions of people at risk of losing their livelihoods and their lives to the climate crisis. For the generations who will inherit the consequences of the actions we do or do not take today. For the vast tapestry of life with which we share this beautiful planet. We don't have the privilege of throwing our hands up in the air and saying, it's too hard, it's too late. We must tip the scales. And this moment demands that we ask, why is the world the way that it is? But what if we did things radically differently? The final thing I will say, people in rooms like this one, people in fashion, you're known for your creativity, your ingenuity, your ability to innovate and determine what's popular. Now, what if we harnessed those attributes? What if we used them as a force for good? My final question, what might be possible if each of you in this room and beyond let your courage, your creativity, and your conviction take flight? Thank you.
Thank you, Clover. We cannot safeguard the climate or stop the extinction crisis if we don't protect the Amazon rainforest. The Amazon is home to an estimated 400 billion trees, over 40,000 plant species, and an ecosystem that helps cool and stabilize our climate. But experts say water stress, land clearance, and climate disruption are pushing the rainforest towards a tipping point we will reach by 2050 if urgent action is not taken now. No one understands the violence being committed against the Amazon like the indigenous communities who reside in it. The Waorani Nation, which currently numbers around 2,000 people, first called the Amazon home tens of thousands of years ago. They once maintained one of the largest territories among indigenous people in Ecuador. Namonte Nenkimo, a Waorani woman and activist, is one of them. Namonte is using her voice to urge people to confront how their businesses and their personal habits are destroying one of the Earth's vital organs. Her activism is rooted in her spirituality and respect for nature. For Namonte, the Amazon is not a resource to be exploited, but a sacred entity that is alive and interconnected with her community's well-being. Namonte led legal action that resulted in a 2019 ruling by the Ecuadorian Supreme Court protecting 500,000 acres of Waorani ancestral land from oil drilling. The following year, this landed her a spot on Time magazine's list of the 100 most influential people in the world in 2020. To share her story, Namonte is joined by Mitch Anderson, her husband, and her partner in activism. They'll be joined in conversation with sustainability advocate and longtime friend of BOF, Bandana Tawari. Please welcome Namonte, Mitch, and Bandana.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. Please. I'm going to get straight to the questions because we are dying to listen to her. But just before that, I'm interviewing my hero. So I'm extremely grateful to BOF Voices and to these two incredible human beings. So we want to know more about you, Namonte. Tell us where you're from, tell us who you represent, and how you grew up. You're mic'd up.
Pues yo soy una mujer wow, vengo del Ecuador, de la Amazonía especialmente. Mi gente, mi pueblo, hace 50 años que hemos contactado de este mundo. Siempre mi pueblo, mis ancestros vivían por miles de años en la Amazonía, ¿no?
My name is Namonte Nenkimo. I'm a Waorani woman from the Ecuadorian Amazon. And my people have been living in the Amazon for thousands of years. And it was only a little more than 50 years ago that my people were contacted by the outside world, by missionaries.
And what has been the impact of deforestation in the Amazon, and how much has it affected your community?
Pues yo primeramente quisiera un poco dar contexto, ¿no? Mi pueblo, mi gente, vivimos muy dentro de la selva, somos muy cercanas con la tierra, muy cercanas con la naturaleza, muy cercanas con los animales, muy cercana espiritualidad y nuestra creencia. A lo largo de este contexto de civilización, supuestamente los misioneros venían volando a nuestro territorio diciendo que tenemos que salir de la selva para poder creer en Jesús, para conectar a otra religión, diciendo nuestra creencia, nuestra sabiduría no vale. Entonces hicieron mucho daño. Los petroleros rodearon nuestro territorio diciendo desarrollo para los pueblos indígenas. Realmente para el mundo de afuera es desarrollo, para nosotros nos impactaron, hicieron daño ambientales, contaminaron nuestros ríos, contaminaron nuestros conocimientos. El gobierno también entrando diciendo grandes gobiernos como defender, nos quitaron nuestros poderes para poder vincular, atraer los petroleros, minería, deforestación. Entonces hemos vivido eso largo de lucha nuestro y no hemos permitido, somos los Waorani 2,000 personas y tenemos más de 2 millones de hectáreas, hemos defendido por miles de años y ahora hemos enfrentado de que eso no vamos a permitir.
I want to begin by just sharing some context about my people and the way we live in our forest, the way we live close to the land. For thousands of years, my people have lived in the Amazon. We live in the forest, harvesting fruits, making gardens, hunting animals, fishing, and we have a deep spiritual connection with our territory. And it was only 70 years ago that the missionaries arrived in our territory. My father saw the missionary planes flying over the forest, circling his longhouse. And when the missionaries landed, they enticed my people with the things of the outside world. And they tried to convince my people that our ways were inferior, that we needed to learn about Jesus, God, we needed to learn a new culture, that our ways in the forest, hunting, harvesting, were no good. They came to try to save us, and in doing so, they caused a lot of harm. And then came the oil companies talking about the need for development. We need to develop your lands, we need to develop your forests. And what ended up happening is they caused massive contamination, deforestation, pollution of our rivers and waterways, and impoverishment of our people. And then the governments came and talking about the rights they have to the land, the rights that they were gonna try to help conserve our territory, but instead they made national parks and displaced the indigenous peoples from our own territories. And so what I want to say is that my people continue to maintain a deep connection with our forests. We continue to fight for our way of life and to protect biodiversity. There's only 2,000 Waorani people, but we currently protect over 2 million hectares of rainforests against innumerable threats. And that's why I'm here today.
Thank you. So, at what point did you decide that you're going to be this incredible activist? And what does this role really mean to you?
Pues a largo de vivencia, los ancestros, yo daba cuenta que los misioneros venían mucho hablando sobre salvación de nuestros almas, venían con una fuerza de limitar nuestra creencia, de tener miedo, que no tengamos fuerza para poder invadir con los petroleros, para poder traer los gobiernos. Entonces, a lo largo de de mi niñez, crecí dos mundos. Entonces, tenía que como ir a otros pueblos donde están presencia con petrolera, porque mucho hablaban los petroleros traen desarrollo en las comunidades para bienestar de vida, pero realmente estaban haciendo daño, estaban contaminando, estaban matando a los niños. Entonces eso hicimos, como ir a otro pueblo, conocer y mover a mi pueblo para poder defender lo que ya está afectado y lo que ya está perdido su territorio, para poder afrontar. La unión nos ha hecho grandes logros, victorias con el gobierno ecuatoriano.
So as a little child, I grew up between two worlds. I grew up the world of my ancestors and the world of my elders, living in the traditional ways, and I grew up with the influences of the missionaries and the outside world. And I realized then that the missionaries had come into our lands and they were making deals with the outside oil companies to try to help facilitate the oil companies' entrance into our people's territories. And so in the eastern part of my land, the oil companies entered into our territory. They created roads, they drilled wells, but I still grew up in an area of the forest that was without oil. And when I became older and a woman, I learned about the oil companies, that they were invading the indigenous communities in the northern part of the Amazon. And so I went to go see, what does it look like to live with the oil companies? What happens to the cultures of our peoples? What happens to the rivers? Can you still hunt? Can you still forage? And that's where I learned that when the oil industry enters into the Amazon rainforest, they create terrible harm and massive destruction. And that's when I realized that together as the original peoples of the Amazon, we need to unite. We need to form alliances to protect our cultures, to protect our rivers, to protect our forests, and to stop the destruction and ultimately to change the system that is destroying our people's lands.
So I want to talk about something that I've been reading a lot about, eco-spirituality, that informs a lot of the activism that Nimonte is engaged with. And I would love to know your thoughts on this, ecology plus spirituality, which is such a big language of the Amazon.
Para mí es conexión con la tierra, espiritualidad. Mientras la selva está viva, la selva es nuestra maestro, que nos enseña a nosotros a respetar y tener amor. Porque nuestros ancestros por miles de años tenían amor, respeto a la madre tierra. La madre tierra no está esperando que humano o nosotros salvemos, no. Nuestra creencia es diferente. Sabemos que la madre está dando toda la vida, el agua, comida, fruta, medicina. Entonces nosotros tenemos esto y muchas veces siento el sistema del mundo es que ven es petróleo, oro y madera. No ven la vitalidad de la vida. Entonces, nosotros tenemos esa conexión, ese amor. No estamos perdiendo. Si la selva enferma, nosotros vamos a enfermar y vamos a desconectar realmente y nos vamos a ser un humano que estamos perdidos.
For us, for the Waorani people, and for indigenous peoples around the world, our land is our teacher. Our land is our mother. For the Waorani, the forest is our teacher. We go into the forest and our teacher provides for us. Our mother provides for us food, shelter, medicines. And that's been happening for thousands of years. And through that relationship of reciprocity, we've come to love our mother, understand our mother, care for our mother. When our mother is sick, we feel sick. We are sick as people. That's the depth of our connection spiritually. And we know that our mother, Mother Earth, is not waiting for us to save her. She's just demanding that we respect her, that we learn to live with her, that we learn to walk lightly, that we learn to love her, because she will continue to provide for us.
It's one of those beautiful quotes that I just remembered, that we don't stand on the land, we are the land. What she does in her activism brings spirituality right back, and I think that is one of the biggest connections that we can have in this movement. Now, on a lighter note, we are all very, very curious to know how the two of you met. Imran particularly is very curious to know, and also do add in what her family thought when you fell in love.
Pues ahí yo podría dar que últimos, después de conocer a él, realmente es verdad. Él viene de Estados Unidos, es otro mundo. Yo soy Waorani de selva, es otro mundo. Nada tiene que comparar la cultura y la vida. Entonces, Mitch es una persona que ha crecido de ese sistema, sino que él se fue a ver lo que pasó con el petróleo, con los pueblos indígenas en el norte del Ecuador. A él le impactó cómo los pueblos indígenas sufrían, el río estaba contaminado, pero para la ciudad llevan gasolina, pero no conocen, no conocen. Como dijo mi papá, mira, Nema, ahora tienes un deber. Ahora mucho en el mundo están hablando cambio climático, está afectando por todo el mundo. Pero los pueblos indígenas, algo muy pequeño, ya sabemos que el mundo, eso está afectando, ya sabemos algo está mal, ¿no? Entonces, yo diría, para que ustedes quieren conocer historia de amor, hemos hecho un libro actualmente, se llama Seremos Jaguares. Esto habla también dentro de mi niñez, de mi juventud y de mi activismo y el trabajo, y como conocimos, habla todo ese resumen, y así que no voy a contestar. Es un deber que pueden ustedes leer primero y hacer preguntas, lo que quieren tener contacto, nuestro trabajo, nuestro activismo, por qué estamos al frente de ese mundo, colaborando, no solamente pueblos indígenas, no indígenas, ¿no?
Yeah, we definitely want all the details. Don't miss out on any details.
She said, if you want to know about the love story, you need to read the book. She said. She said that at the end, but I had to translate that at the beginning. Nemo said that it's true. My partner Mitch comes from a completely different culture. He grew up in this world here. He grew up in the system very far away from the forest, and I grew up in the Ecuadorian Amazon with my people. And she said that she met me more than a decade ago because I was living and working with indigenous communities that were impacted by oil contamination, and that I had come to the Amazon to understand how our addiction to oil was creating massive environmental and human health and cultural and spiritual harm to peoples that were defending the lands and living off the forests. And we began building access to clean water with communities in Ecuador's northern Amazon, and it was through building access to clean water I met Nemonte. We met each other. And she said that she thinks that I came to the Amazon to learn about something that everybody needs to learn about here, which is that this system and civilization and the life of cities and our consumption is causing immense harm to cultures, to human health, to ecosystems, in places as far away as the Amazon rainforest and in places that are as important ecologically and climatically to our planet. And she said that her father and her elders always say that for them, the outsiders are coming in and they're destroying what they don't understand. They don't comprehend. And that's why we wrote a book together, which she said is called We Will Be Jaguars in the US, and it's called We Will Not Be Saved here in the UK. Two different titles, two provocative meanings. And she also said that for indigenous peoples, we don't need to wait for big weather events and storms and massive floods to understand the changes that are happening to the ecosystem, to nature, to our mother. We see in what might seem to you all the smallest differences, the smallest shifts, the smallest from fruits that don't flower in the trees. We can see the climate change is occurring in our lands. And so that's why we're here to share our story and our knowledge with all of you.
So let's go to the incredible legal victory that you had in the Supreme Court in 2018 and what implications it has for future indigenous land rights.
La victoria legal, primera vez en la historia en el Ecuador, para mí es algo significante y muy importante. Primero es como la lucha hay que unir. No solamente pueblos guaraní, unimos con otros pueblos. Y segundo es liderazgo de una mujer. Eso lo cambió históricamente, porque muchas de las veces liderazgo de los hombres es más fácil, quieren dinero y quieren invertir, pero las mujeres somos madres, que pensamos mucho más allá, pensamos en el futuro, si consecuencias, si aceptamos petróleo, ¿qué va a perjudicar el medio ambiente, la cultura, conocimiento y la consecuencia en el futuro que van a vivir nuestros hijos? Entonces eso a lo largo de mi liderazgo ha sido primero unir con las mujeres, levantar las mujeres, unir con otros pueblos. Y decimos, justo en el año 2019, el Estado ecuatoriano estaba haciendo una oferta donde nosotros vivimos, en las comunidades, una oferta que se puede negociar en cualquier país, el petróleo. Entonces dijimos, no vamos a permitir, es nuestra casa, por miles de años nuestros ancestros defendían, y eso es la vida que nos da el oxígeno al mundo, entonces debemos proteger. Entonces eso hemos hecho un histórico fallo, primera vez eso precedente quedó para los demás pueblos que pueden tomar su decisión en su territorio.
So in 2018 and 2019, Nemo said that she was the first female leader of the Waorani people and led a legal victory against the Ecuadorian government. And she said there are two things that are most important to understand how we were able to win this battle. The first is that we made alliances. It wasn't just the Waorani people alone, but it was an alliance between indigenous peoples across the Upper Amazon and people around the world and activists around the world. Secondly, women's leadership. Women need to be leading across the world. Women are connected to our lands, connected to our cultures, connected to our families. We're thinking about the future. We're connected spiritually. We believe in harmony, creating consensus. And as a woman leader, I was able to bring together women, listen to our elders, inspire our youth, and we took to the streets. And the Ecuadorian government wanted to auction off our territories, indigenous people's lands, to the international oil industry. And so we filed a lawsuit against the government saying that we have the right to our homes, to our lands. These are our territories. We have the right to free, prior, and informed consent. And the judicial system agreed with us. We set a legal precedent. We protected 500,000 hectares of our territory, stopped an oil auction of 7 million acres of Amazon rainforest, and set a legal precedent for other indigenous nations across the Amazon to protect their lands.
So time for one question, which I'll go back to this incredible camaraderie, this love that we can all feel, the energy between the two of you. And so working with this phenomenal Mitch, how much has he helped you bolster your activism as a female leader?
Pues en ese sentido, Mitch ha sido todo para mí, sido como mamá. Muchas veces ser liderazgo necesitamos tener un esposo que comprende, que acompaña en las luchas, en hogar, en una estructura también organizativa, porque ha habido muchas veces, si el hombre no permite, las mujeres tenemos toda capacidad, toda fuerza, no podemos lograr. Entonces eso ha sido, los dos hemos sido un colaborativo. Mitch ha sido uno de los que viene de afuera. También el Mitch era como escuchar a los pueblos indígenas y apoyar y respetarlo. Eso, el respeto ha sido más importante. Y luego, después del respeto, él ha cogido la confianza en nuestro territorio donde estamos trabajando, en varias comunidades, en varios pueblos indígenas, no solamente en mis comunidades.
Now speak about yourself.
Nemo said that Mitch has been everything for me. He's been also like a mother to our kids. He said that he's been there for me and helped lift me up. And he moved from far away, and he lived in our territory and lived with indigenous communities across the Amazon and learned how to listen, learned how to respect our people and our ways. And he's supported in the creation of an organizational structure that can build power, political and cultural power for indigenous communities across the Amazon. And there's women around the world have the capacity, the power, the vision to lead, and a lot of times the men in their lives don't let them and make it hard for them, and that can't happen.
Thank you very much. Amazing. Thank you, Mitch. Thank you, Brad.
Thank you, Namonte, Mitch, and Bandana. They said you should read the book. Everyone here has received a copy of Namonte's memoir in your gift bags. And if you're interested in supporting Amazon Frontlines, the organization that Mitch and Namonte have founded, please check our WhatsApp community chat and the live stream chat for all of you watching online. And there's some information there on how you can support. Thank you very much. So now we're going to switch gears. a little bit. By 2100, almost half of the world's youth will come from Africa, which already has the youngest population of any continent. We saw that in the chart earlier that Sven Smith showed. But the way it is depicted in Western media doesn't typically show this side of Africa, which is actually brimming with youth and potential. Our next speaker, Fred Swaniker, is on a mission to shift the narrative about Africa from one that is focused on the lack of demand to one that recognizes its abundant supply of talent. As Time magazine wrote, when Fred was also named to their list of the world's 100 most influential people, Africa's greatest asset is also its defining challenge, its growing population of young people. Please welcome Fred Swaniker.
In the last 4 years, since 2020, over 10,000 young people have died from Africa, trying to cross the seas to Europe and the rest of the world. Every other week, we'll see a scene like this on television of young people risking their lives, trying to make it to a better life. So today, I'd like to talk a bit about some of the root causes underlying this issue and what I see as a potential to transform this into a great opportunity for Africa and the rest of the world in this century. As Sven mentioned earlier, and as Imran just mentioned, Africa is young and it's fast growing, right? By the end of the century, the young people in Africa will be double than the entire population of Europe, right? Yes, that's true. And the average age of an African is 19. And in the next decade, Africa will have a workforce larger than China and larger than India, right? So this is a massive population that's growing fast. How many of you in this room would work for $230 a month? Can I see a show of hands, please? No one? This is the salary of an average college graduate in Africa, right? Someone who's been to college, who worked hard, done UX design, they've done software engineering, and then they look for a job. It takes them 5 years to get a job. After they get a job, this is what they're paid across the continent. We survey young people across, employers who are looking for jobs, to hire people, and this is the data that we see. So if this is the context, it's happening simply because there's an excess supply of talent and not enough demand for it. Typical economics. When supply exceeds demand, the price drops, right? And this is because Africa's GDP is only 3% of the world's GDP. So in this context, it's no wonder that people are leaving, looking for a better life. At the same time, Europe is old and aging. Right? The average age of a European is 43. Germany is 46.8. Germany is from Italy. I know how old you guys are. Much younger. And Monaco is 55, right? So the way in which we're able to navigate this moment, where you have one part of the world that has too much supply of talent and another part that has not enough talent. There's a shortage of 18 million nurses in the world. This is going to be one of the defining issues of this century. And so when 40% of the world's population is going to come from Africa by the end of the century, and 50% of its young people, this will be the African century. Because where Africa goes is where this century will go. The only question is whether it's going to be a good century or a bad century. But whether we like it or not, this is going to be the African century. So how can we make sure that it's a good century? I believe that the secret lies in how the world navigates and negotiates this issue, right? And I believe that it lies in what I call talent exports. Africa, simply put, needs to export its talent, and Europe and the rest of the world needs to import Africa's talent. Now you might say, what about brain drain and immigration? Yes, those are big issues. But talent exports does not necessarily mean immigration. It doesn't mean brain drain either. There are three ways in which talent exports happens. The first is that talent can stay in Africa and it can work remotely. I run a company called Sand Technologies. We build sophisticated industrial artificial intelligence for global companies and for global governments. So think of us like Palantir, except we don't do CIA and defense stuff, right? We do peaceful things. Like ensure that your water in the city of London flows. Our AI systems are managing the water supply for the entire city of London. 16 million homes. We're predicting when a pipe is going to burst in the city. We're preventing pollution from going to the oceans and rivers. We're helping the city plan where to build more infrastructure. So next time you turn on your tap in London and there's water flowing, it's because our AI systems are managing the system more properly. We're even putting sensors in the rivers in the UK. That's tracking the health of the river. So you'll be able to put in your home address and we can tell you the health of the river that feeds your home before you drink it. And this talent sits in Africa. And they don't earn $230 a month. They earn $2,000 a month. They earn $5,000 a month. And every person who earns that and stays in Africa can spend it in the shops. They can get their hair done. They can buy clothes. One talent like that, a job that is exported, but without the brain drain, it is equivalent to 10 to 15 jobs in Africa, right? Or we also work in telecommunications. Our AI systems are helping about 1.7 billion consumers around the world to ensure that when they make a phone call, the antennas are pointing at the right place and that it captures your voice properly, or that you can watch your YouTube video on your phone. We're designing AI, all the networks, our AI systems are helping to figure out where to lay fiber in continental USA. 4 million homes are connected because of the algorithms that our engineers built. And in India, Reliance Jio, we're helping to figure out where to put 5G towers in the country, and Indonesia as well. We recently trained about 250 doctors on how to become data scientists. And then we partnered with the Stanford School of Medicine to train them in precision medicine. The target for this talent is not just to work in Africa. They're sitting in Africa. I'm about to start a collaboration with the American Cancer Society to ensure that they can help identify the exact treatment for cancer patients using precision medicine. So your life, should you ever get cancer, could depend on the accuracy of the medicine, that the precision to which these doctors are able to prescribe you, sitting in Africa. The second way in which talent exports happens is companies can go and set up operations in Africa and hire that talent locally. Some of you may know since we're at a fashion industry event, Bestseller Corporation, a large Danish corporation in fashion. We helped them set up a center in Rwanda of engineers who are building and maintaining their e-commerce websites from Africa. Or Google and Amazon have recently set up operations there to hire some of this talent. India has 2 million people who work for US corporations and global corporations like Boeing and McKinsey and so forth, sitting in India, but serving the rest of the world, right? And this is the second way in which talent exports happens. The third way in which talent exports happens, again, these first two, there's no immigration, there's no brain drain. The third way is the one that maybe we talk about, yes, where for jobs that cannot be done remotely, like nursing or construction or security or hospitality, then yes, people would have to leave. But if it's managed properly, it's a way in which everyone benefits, right? So the key at the end of the day, as Iman mentioned, is that the world needs to shift the way in which we think about Africa. Today, when we look at Africa, we think of it as as a source of demand. And there's not much demand in Africa for our businesses. It's only 3% of the world's GDP. We need to instead look at Africa as a source of supply, immense supply of talent, but also of innovation and ingenuity. Because young people tend to be the most innovative in the world, right? This is a picture of Derek. It's a young man that I met recently. He's figured out how to generate electricity literally from thin air. That antenna that he's holding is absorbing the electromagnetic waves that come from cell phone towers. And he's harnessing and recycling it into energy to light homes. This is a global innovation in a time when we're talking about energy transition that is coming from Africa. It's another young man who's developed a chip that processes data with 50% more efficiency and 30% less energy. It's using something called spintronics, not electronics, using the natural energy of an electron and not needing to use electricity. So in the AI era, and he's building this VR headset that can process at much faster speed than anyone. So next time you are watching a live concert or something else in VR, it could be because of the Spintronics headset that this Moroccan gentleman has developed. Well, there's a Nigerian man who's built the first artificial intelligence chip that can smell things. So he's taken the cells from a dog's nose and fused it onto a chip. And it can detect 3,000 compounds. It can smell whether you're healthy or not. It can look at, well, it can detect bombs. It can detect drugs. It can maybe even help you develop the next world's best-selling perfume. Right? And all of this is the first in the world. Again, it's a global innovation developed by Africans, right? So this is, I can go on and on and on about phenomenal. This year, 2,000 tech startups came out of, we're training about 250,000 software engineers and data scientists in Africa who work for SAN Technologies company, but they're also building all these great ventures. And you can just imagine what's going to happen as this talent pool grows for the world. So for all this to happen, two things need to occur. First, obviously we need to solve the political challenges of, navigating talent flows and immigration and all those things. But like I said, talent exports does not mean brain drain. It does not mean immigration. Yes, in some cases it does need to be, right? But if we manage it carefully and face the facts, we're going to go from something that is chaotic to something that is orderly and where actually the entire world benefits. The second thing that needs to change is the narrative, right? When we look at Africa, we typically see all of these images of starvation and warfare and all these things that is not actually what Africa typically looks like. Yes, that exists. I remember growing up, I used to watch Hollywood, and I thought America was the land of milk and honey. I go to college in the US, and I land in Newark, New Jersey. When I got out of the airport, I said, "What, is this the land of milk and honey?" Because the US has been able to really drive its own narrative. So I'm very excited about the fact that now there's a new generation of young Africans that, thanks to technology, can tell their own story at a much faster rate and much cheaper than ever before. All right? We're seeing the rise of the African creative and the African storyteller and the African movie maker. This force is something that most of us do not realize how big this is going to be. Right. 1 million creatives are going to be trained in the next decade. And they're going to be able to tell their own story. Today, we're already seeing Burna Boy selling out O2 Arena, and he gets paid $1 million. Wizkid, Tiwa Savage. All of this talent that now, if you're a global musician, you have to collaborate with an African musician, right? Justin Bieber, Selena Gomez, everyone. They're realizing that this is driving the natural zeitgeist. So this is going to happen in film, it's going to happen in music, it's going to happen in gaming, it's going to happen in animation, and we can tell our own story. And by the way, this is another example of talent exports. Because Burna Boy used to be paid $50,000 or $10,000 performing in Africa. Now when he performs globally, he gets paid $1 million per show, and that's creating lots of jobs for people in Africa, right? All the fashion designers that design his fashion, all of the social media artists, specialists and his lawyer, everyone, they're staying in Africa, and is creating livelihood. So, in summary, if the world is going to win, if you're not convinced yet, look at this team. This is the French national team that captivated us in the last World Cup. 15 of the players out of 24 came from Africa. So whether you want to win in business, you want to win in sports, you want to win in fashion, you want to win in music, you want to win in technology, your future depends on Africa. And this is why I say that this is the African century. Thank you.
My family is from Kenya and Tanzania, so I'm from Africa too. We had Tiwa Savage here in 2018, and we had WizKid perform at the BOF 500, which brought down the house in September. So we are in the African vibe here too. Thank you so much, Fred. That was absolutely fantastic. Over the last year, as the world has witnessed the horrors unfolding in Israel, Gaza, and Lebanon, many people have felt fearful to talk about what is happening or to share the intense personal feelings that the war has raised. This is not because the situation doesn't fill people with sadness or upset, but because people are afraid of upsetting or offending someone else, or they're afraid of the consequences of speaking up. This has had a chilling effect on how we talk about one of the defining topics of our time. This did not happen when terrorists struck down the World Trade Center on 9/11, or more recently when war broke out in Ukraine. But by suppressing debate, each side becomes more entrenched in their positions, only resulting in further polarization. We retreat into filter bubbles. We only hear the perspectives of people who think like us. If we remain fearful of discussing topics like this in our communities, we will become more extreme in our views and less able to resolve the issues that may divide us. This is why I felt it was really important to raise the topic of free speech at BOF Voices. Our goal is not to discuss the conflict itself, but rather to empower people to talk about this and other sensitive topics openly. To guide us through this conversation, I sought out two speakers. One has an expert perspective on free speech and why it is a critical part of healthy democratic societies. The other has deep and first-hand understanding of this decades-old conflict. Jamil Jaffer is the executive director of the Knight First Amendment Institute at Columbia University. He was the director of the American Civil Liberties Union Center for Democracy, where he led work relating to free speech, national security, and international human rights. He has argued in the US Supreme Court and has testified many times before Congress. Daniel Levy is the president of the US Middle East Project. He was chairman of the World Union of Jewish Students in Jerusalem from 1991 to 94, and is a former Israeli peace negotiator with the Palestinians under Prime Ministers Ehud Barak and Yitzhak Rabin. Please welcome Jamil Jaffer and Daniel Levy.
Thank you, Imran. And Daniel, it's great to be here with you. So I want to start by underscoring what Imran just said, which is that I'm not here because I have some deep expertise in the conflict in the Middle East. I definitely do not. I'm here because I know something about free speech. I have written a lot about the importance of free speech to democratic societies, and I've litigated a lot of cases involving conflicts or perceived conflicts between free speech and other important values like equality, or security. I've also had an unusual vantage point on the student protests relating to the war, because I run a free speech institute at Columbia University, which is where the student protest movement began. And I think I want to say something about what happened at Columbia, although I assume that most of you have seen at least some of this. But I want to say something about what happened at Columbia, because what happened at Columbia also happened on many other campuses in the United States and around the world. And I think what happened on university campuses is a kind of microcosm of what happened in our societies more broadly. So here's what happened at Columbia. At Columbia, many students demonstrated in solidarity with Israelis after October 7th. Many other students demonstrated in solidarity with Palestinians in the weeks and months afterwards. There were demonstrations and counter-demonstrations. There were allegations of anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, and racism. Students set up an encampment on Columbia's campus, and Columbia called in the police department, the NYPD, to dismantle the encampment, and they arrested hundreds of students who were protesting peacefully. Then other students occupied a university building, the same building that students had occupied during anti-apartheid protests in the 1980s. And Columbia called in the NYPD again and arrested those students. So there was this very contentious and divisive debate on Columbia's campus about the war, about Israel and Gaza and what was going on there. But there was also kind of meta debate about free speech, about how we should and can talk about the war. And the debate around free speech revolved around questions like, what are the limits of the right to speak freely? How do we reconcile our commitment to free speech with our commitment to other values like inclusion? How do we foster cultures in which disagreement and debate are productive rather than destructive? And what should we ask and expect from our institutions in this regard? Not just our public institutions, but from private ones as well, like private universities and publishers and museums and other cultural institutions. But Daniel, your background is very different from mine. You should tell everybody about that.
Well, I guess in contrast to you, Jamil, and thank you, I'm here because I'm so deeply steeped in the intestines of Israel-Palestine. So for me, it's a brief few minutes looking through the microscope end. I grew up in a Jewish, religiously observant Holocaust survivor home. As was mentioned, I get elected to become president of the World Jewish Students, move to Israel, become a dual citizen. In my military service, I'm pulled into the negotiations under then Prime Minister Rabin with the Palestinians. I served later in the government of Ehud Barak as a political appointee, a senior advisor, again back in the negotiations during the end of the Clinton presidency. So I'm an average-aged European. And Clover was about 1 year old when I was doing that. And in addition to the close friendships I built with Palestinian counterparts in those talks, what that negotiating experience made clear to me, if I was going to get this right, I would have to develop a deep familiarity with the layers of experience and the lived realities and perspectives of Palestinians. So my professional life has been about conflict resolution, but also about how to speak on this conflict and to this conflict in different spaces. I worked for a period in America, in Europe, in think tanks, and increasingly my work is how does this issue relate to the global south? So I've been invited in recent years by Kenya and China, by their governments, as well as Germany, to brief the UN Security Council. When October 7th comes, many of my Israeli friends have losses, friends and family. I have a distant cousin who is a hostage. Within days, the ability to focus exclusively on that pain becomes unsustainable as Palestinian friends raise the alarm. What are Israeli leaders telling us about what they're going to do to Palestinians? Within days, they're telling us that food, fuel, water, electricity will be cut to all people. And by the end of October of last year, more Palestinian children have been killed in Gaza than are killed across the world in all conflicts in any regular year, according to Save the Children. A mass bombing campaign, schools, hospitals, and it has not yet let up. And for over a year now, we've been looking at the same event and seeing different things. And so you started to speak, Jamil, about how the institutions, the spaces that you work in, have been dealing with those kind of cognitive gaps. Take us to the next stage of how are they doing?
Yeah. Well, so I guess my view is that the institutions that we really need to foster a culture of free speech have failed us over the past year. Since October 7th, 2023, there's been this tidal wave of censorship and suppression, mostly of pro-Palestinian voices, but sometimes of pro-Israel voices as well. Universities suspended student groups, they imposed new restrictions on the right to protest, they canceled film screenings and public events, they limited access to campuses. Museums canceled artist exhibitions and journals withdrew articles, bookstores canceled readings and debates. Some of the biggest law firms in New York City said they would not hire students who participated in protests. I think to find a historical analog to all of that, you need to go back all the way to the McCarthy era, when the House Committee on Un-American Activities was trying to root out suspected communists in universities and in Hollywood. Now, that isn't to say that this wave of suppression has been entirely effective. Plainly, it hasn't been. Many people continue to speak out about the conflict. And in some cases, the suppression has been a catalyst for dissent. That's what happened on Columbia's campus. But I think it's fair to say that this wave of suppression has had a real and even profound effect on the willingness of ordinary people to engage. Everyone knows that engaging publicly on this topic is perilous. Every word is closely policed, and a misstep can have significant professional and personal consequences. You may notice that both Daniel and I are talking with notes. So unsurprisingly, many people are fearful of engaging on this topic. They don't engage publicly, and my sense is that they don't engage privately either. And the result of that is that we're not having conversations that we need to have. Why do we need to have them? I think because if we don't have these kinds of conversations, we end up, as Imran intimated earlier, retreating into echo chambers and becoming more polarized, and we cut off the possibility of social change. We know from our own history that social change isn't possible without people changing their minds. And the only way people change their minds is to encounter others who have views different from their own. Every social movement that you can identify grew out of encounters with difference. And I think that's what we are missing right now. But Daniel, does your experience conform to what I just described?
Yeah, I mean, largely, and I am trying to think about this question of how do you unpack this polarization. And from where I'm coming from, it begins with, look, this is war. War is about disinformation campaigns. It's about psychological warfare. Now we also have the added joys of the algorithm. There is, and this mustn't be lost on people, there is a vast asymmetry of power between Israelis and Palestinians over there, but it's mirrored in terms of who has access to power over here. So for me, part of the story is that Palestinians and those who are Palestinian adjacent often feel overwhelmingly disempowered. And in those rare spaces where the tables are turned on that dynamic, student councils, a patch of grass on a campus, maybe a football stadium, there can be an excess in the other direction. To be parochial for a moment, something that features prominently for me and is often lost in these binaries is that Jewish people are not a monolith. Unsurprisingly, there's no single opinion and there are deep ruptures, and some of you may have been exposed to that. The attempt to impose a uniformity of thinking around Israel goes against the grain of all Jewish history. As with other peoples, different ideas have always competed for the hearts and minds of Jewish people. There's no single truth. Now, for any state, including Israel, it makes sense to instrumentalize the assets they have for their own PR and messaging purposes. And there has been an instrumentalization by Israel of Jewish experience and communities, even a weaponization of anti-Semitism. Now, I argue that's not good for Jews. Anti-Semitism is real and serious. Protesting against mass killing, marching for peace, is not anti-Semitism. I'm sure it's not always a comfortable conversation for people to be pulled into, but it is absolutely legitimate for Jews or anyone else to question what is going on there, what is Israel doing, what Zionism means for Palestinians, etc. And then for Palestinians, and not just for Palestinians, but many other people of color, indigenous people, people in the global south who have lived through colonization, settler colonialism, liberation struggles, apartheid, they look at this and see something very familiar, often seeing themselves in the Palestinian story of displacement, rights denial, structural violence and inequality, and a struggle for freedom. The sense of a life less valued by the West. And of course, the often experienced recourse to Islamophobic discourse. Now, for me, if we're going to do better, we have to be able to hold this space for complexity. So easy last one, Jamil. How do we do better?
Well, okay, so I think if we're going to open up the space for these kinds of conversations, a couple things have to happen. First, our institutions have to create space for them, which takes a kind of civic courage that is unfortunately in short supply right now. It takes a kind of civic courage for a Jewish cultural institution to invite pro-Palestinian speakers to speak at their events. And it takes a kind of civic courage for, say, a progressive bookstore in New York to host readings by people who describe themselves as Zionists. But we desperately need that kind of civic courage at the institutional level. At the individual level, I think we need to afford each other a kind of interpretive charity. And that's a phrase that I learned from a friend of mine, Genevieve Lakier, who's a professor at the University of Chicago Law School, interpretive charity. We need to resist the very human tendency to understand our opponents in the least generous way. There's been this debate, as Daniel alluded to just a second ago, about slogans and symbols. For example, Palestine shall be free from the river to the sea, or the Palestinian kafia. The truth is that political speech is often emotional and ambiguous and susceptible to more than one interpretation. That's especially true when it comes to symbols and slogans. A phrase like river to the sea doesn't have a single fixed meaning. People use phrases like that in different ways and for different reasons, and people hear them in different ways too. That's true of Palestinian symbols and slogans, and it's true of Israeli symbols and slogans as well. Some Jews hear river to the sea as a call for genocide. Some Palestinians see the Israeli flag as a symbol of their people's dispossession and even elimination. It's very tempting to give your opponent's statements the least charitable meaning, but productive engagement, I think, requires just the opposite. So I don't want to pretend that these conversations are easier than they are. They're not easy, but they're necessary. And I know this from my own personal experience. So a long time ago, 25 years ago, I was a clerk on the Supreme Court of Canada, just after I graduated from law school. This was the year 2000, which happened to be the year that the Second Intifada broke out. And I was very sympathetic to the Palestinians. I had a friend, a co-clerk, who was very sympathetic, equally sympathetic to the Israelis. And we used to argue all the time, sometimes pretty viciously. To be honest, I didn't always formulate my arguments in the most sensitive way. And he didn't either. I definitely regret some of the things I said, and I'm very grateful that this was before the era of social media and before all of our statements and conversations were recorded in massive permanent databases. But we learned a lot from each other. And at the very least, we came to understand better where the other person was coming from. And both of us changed our minds about some things, changed our minds in those conversations, and have changed our minds since as well. And I worry that those kinds of conversations aren't happening right now. But let me ask you the same question. What should we be doing differently?
Well, look, for me, because I think about over there, the starting point has to be a better future for both peoples in the Holy Land itself. And that means you can't go with zero-sum approaches. There cannot be a future for Israeli Jews at the expense of Palestinians or vice versa. A vision of greater Israel without rights for Palestinians, which is more or less today's reality. The only river to the sea politics that exists is that. The relentless settlement expansion, West Bank, plans to resettle Gaza, all that should be considered beyond the pale. But if I zoom out, then when I think about this, what I've seen in the last year is that one of the obstacles to more constructive engagement is also how this is covered in our own media. And to acknowledge the limitations of the media echo chamber in the West. So check how you're being influenced. Does the coverage offer context, or is it decontextualized? Does your media outlet have people on the ground in Gaza? Are you hearing Palestinian voices or Lebanese? Are you aware of how many Palestinian journalists have been killed in this last year telling this story? Is an Israeli narrative very familiar, but a Palestinian narrative outside of your comfort zone and treated a priori with suspicion, or vice versa? And again, to flip it, in the global south, it looks very different. Are Jewish or Israeli perspectives being heard? Beyond the West, a narrative of decolonization resonates in very immediate and tangible ways. And I know this can get scary to talk about. My own experience is that processing this with people who care, whether Jewish, Israeli, Palestinian, Arab, Muslim, or none of the above, it does involve an investment of time and empathetic listening. And if none of that convinces you, then all I've got for you is this issue isn't going away. And it isn't going to get any easier. And I respect Imran for bringing this into this space. And we will need to challenge our preconceptions. And if I end by looking briefly through the telescope, then where there is war in the Middle East or elsewhere, then the most destructive industries are benefiting. And we're not focusing on those things that we've heard on the stage today, on the climate crisis, on building a regenerative economy, and on social justice. Thank you so much.
Tina Brown is a force of nature in the world of journalism, offering unflinching and sometimes provocative glimpses into the lives of the world's most famous figures. Born in England and educated at Oxford, she stormed the traditionally male bastions of print media, becoming editor-in-chief of Tatler magazine at the age of just 25. Just a few years later, she ushered in a new era as editor-in-chief of Vanity Fair, which at the time was tens of millions of dollars in debt. Her unique formula of seductive storytelling, combined with hard-hitting journalism, increased the magazine's monthly circulation from 200,000 to 1.2 million. Indeed, Vanity Fair came to define the cultural conversation. Tina profiled Nancy and Ronald Reagan, gaining rare access to their private lives. There's that photo of them dancing on the cover. Later, she lifted the veil on Princess Diana's marriage and to then Prince Charles. And in 1991, she featured a nude Demi Moore on the cover of Vanity Fair, presaging the viral moments that all magazine covers now aim to create. As an editor, Tina has never been afraid to push boundaries or challenge the orthodoxy. And at the age of 70, she has not lost her magic touch. Earlier this year, I had the pleasure of speaking at the Aspen Ideas Festival, which Tina wonderfully curated. I was able to see up front just how plugged in she remains to contemporary society, politics, and culture. Just last month, she launched a weekly Substack newsletter called Fresh Hell, Tina Brown's Diary, where she has already opined on trending topics from the Menendez brothers to the election of Donald Trump. To reflect on the state of media, politics, and culture, and to close our session on the wider world, please welcome Tina Brown to the Voices stage.
See you, Imran. Good to see you.
You too.
This is really an amazing occasion, I must say.
I'm
Combination of high style and brain sex, I decided.
Oh, I love that. The new slogan for Voices.
Yes. It's
High
just-
style and brain sex. Okay, Tina, let's get into it. US election.
Mm-hmm.
As I was doing my reading and research over the weekend, I came to learn that you actually knew Donald Trump very well during his rise in New York.
Mm-hmm.
There's a famous story of you sitting next to him at a dinner in the 1980s or 90s. Before covering what's happening now, what were your impressions of him back then? What was he like, and how did that change over time?
Well, in those days, he was a sort of rough diamond, outrageous carnival barker, New York character that actually was very refreshing, I thought. I mean, I published in Vanity Fair the extract of his famous book, The Art of the Deal. And, it was exactly as he is now, but without the darkness. What has changed, I think, because in those days he was almost, I wouldn't say sunny, but there was something very up about him. And he's become very dark as the years have gone by. I mean, the man that we see now, the last time, at the Madison Square Garden rally, which was a sort of 30s kind of, foaming at the mouth, dark, anti everything about sort of that was about life, it seemed. That's very different. So he's changed an enormous amount, I think, from those early days.
But you kind of knew, because in your book, The Vanity Fair Diaries, you wrote, "It feels when you have finished it as if you've been nose to nose for 4 hours with an entertaining con man. I suspect the American public will like nothing better."
Indeed, yes. Well, I could, he has great appeal. He did and does now. I mean, whatever one says, and one can a lot about Trump, he is the world's great showman. I mean, he ran a campaign that was just endlessly watchable and was so extraordinarily sort of resourceful and improvising all the time, as he went along. I mean, his stunt with the, at McDonald's, for instance, when he was...
Which went viral.
Which totally went viral, puts on an apron, starts serving out, the French fries through the windows. I mean, it's incredible. He gets into a dumpster truck and drives the garbage truck because of the comment that of garbage. He is so quick to sense that zeitgeist, that pivot, and he knows exactly how to do it. it's really a sixth sense that you have to, frankly admire in terms of his
it was
technique.
like he was made for the social media world that we live in, so that he knows how to, captivate people.
And I think that what's happened really is that, in a sense, we've become so debased by entertainment values that we now require our politicians to be entertainment. And I actually question whether the old-style politician, will ever be in favor again. Some years back, when I was at the Daily Beast, I commissioned Bret Easton Ellis to write an essay about the crazy antics at the time of Charlie Sheen. And he wrote a brilliant essay about how Charlie Sheen was, as he put it, post-empire. That there was empire and there was post-empire. And empire was about, being buttoned up, being, presenting yourself in a way for the public versus to the private. And all that in Charlie Sheen had gone. And he was just like letting it all hang out, totally foul-mouthed, crazy, an addict, all of this. And he identified it, Bret, as this post-empire style. And what we've really seen is that post-empire has won. And I don't know that we're ever going to go back to the kind of politician that a Joe Biden was, that a Kamala Harris was. I think Americans now value the entertainment values more than anything else. And Trump has done that, essentially.
We heard Ravi Agarwal's pretty analytical assessment of the impact of, Trump's return to the White House on the world. I'm curious about your take. You've now lived in the U.S. for 40 years, is that right? We understood what kind of the impact is for the world. What's your take on what this means for American democracy? As I said in my introduction, there's been so much hand-wringing about what this means for the future of the U.S., which is, like it or not, we all are impacted what's happening there.
Well, I sort of, I kind of flipped from being a historical optimist to a sort of hysterical pessimist. I wake up one or the other. What we haven't seen before, of course, is a completely unfettered Trump. The first time in his 2016 victory, he was held down by the fact that, he didn't have every branch of government. But he has every branch of government now. He's going to have the House, not quite finished the elections there, but Republicans are winning. They've won the Senate. He's totally, politicized the Supreme Court and now has his toadies there. And he has the White House. So now he's completely unfettered. And he's also realized last time around, because he didn't know anybody, didn't expect to win and was in a state of constant chaos, he sort of appointed people that other people told him to appoint who hadn't taken the sort of the oath of allegiance, as it were, to Trump. That's gone. The last 4 years, you only get to join him now if you're a true believer. So he's now surrounded by the true believers. And there's no one to sort of say him nay. Now, we're all thinking, if you're the hysterical pessimist, you think, this is, everything he wants is going to happen. No one is going to stop him. But the thing about Trump is he's so unpredictable. He could also turn on his true believers. If things go wrong, for instance, if he does his tariff thing, which he seems to be obsessed with and has been one of the very few consistent sort of themes of his entire sort of life, is tariff obsession for some reason. But if inflation suddenly, goes crazy, he will turn on everybody and blame them and they'll be gone, So there is that caprice which you can almost kind of rely on. Mm-hmm. And, of course, in the midterms, the Republicans could lose the House and the Senate, So in which case you're going to have, some of those restraints kind of back on him again. But this is going to be a time for courage, and we haven't seen very much of it. The entire Republican Party just turned into moral amoeba, sort of incredibly so. I mean, people who had stood up against him and had denounced him and so on when he lost and went on every talk show, now just flipped and they're back groveling in a way it's really, I have never seen it before, how they can actually look in the mirror and see the sound bites of themselves saying, the man has got absolutely no integrity, January the 6th was a disgraceful blah, blah. Then they turn around and say, I'm voting for Trump, and they're trying to get a job, and it's really remarkable, and I'm not quite sure why they've become so desperately cowardly.
There's one other entity that could theoretically also hold Trump to account. We talked about the Senate, and we talked about Congress and the House, and we talked about the Supreme Court. There's also the media.
Absolutely. Well, that's exactly.
And so, what is happening in American media at the moment? You have such an interesting vantage point. The media has been kind of whipped into this polarization. I'm just curious about your take of like how you see that.
Well, I mean, I think that we are now, as you say, I mean, the resistance is going to have to come from the media. And there's this narrative that has now got going, of course, pushed really by Trump, which is that the media is untrustworthy, that everybody's, it's partisan or so. But I mean, that is actually really not true of the majority of, hardworking American journalists. I mean, they are trying to get it right. What I think is more scary now is the fact that the media owners, are what is the problem, because they are now terrified of their businesses being impacted by Trump. And we saw what happened at the Washington Post. I mean, Jeff Bezos from Amazon, who bought the Washington Post some years back, he was a very stalwart owner in the first term, actually. He backed his editor in a way that was quite admirable, in fact. But now, just before the election, he killed the endorsement of Harris by the opinion section, which was unheard of. That ever since Watergate, they've always endorsed a candidate, and once Bezos heard it was Kamala, bam, he killed it. He was like the first, or I think at least one of the first of the sort of digital oligarchs to tweet, his congratulations of Trump. You see that he's pivoted, and just yesterday, the owner of the LA Times just has swept out the entire editorial board and has said he's going to have a new editorial board. And you're seeing really what's happened in Modi's India, essentially, which is, you don't have to tell the journalists what to write. You simply have to create a culture where, you don't get hired if you write anything that's going to antagonize Trump. And, we've seen in India how the free press has been decimated because the way Modi operates is he goes for those corporate owners. If he can't, get those corporate owners to sort of play ball, then eventually, a friend of Modi will buy the media outlet. He has constant lawfare against journalists where they're sued for, crimes that have nothing to do with journalism, or their taxes are audited and they're called tax felons. So he goes after journalists for other reasons than the journalism. And of course, he goes after advertisers so that the advertisers don't want to be advertising in something that's anti-Modi. And that is, I think, that the route you're going to see happens in the US if Trump does what he's promising, and he tends to do it. I mean, he calls the media the enemy of the people. I mean, he is hostile to the point of, lunacy, really, about media that tell the truth. And I think you're going to see a lot of fear in the owners. The journalists, I think, a lot of them are doing really great work. And my heroes right now are journalists, because I think they are giving their lives. They are one of the last kind of portions of society anywhere that are not doing it for the money. I mean, nobody makes any money, as a journalist. That is one global fact we can all say. They do it for passion. They do it for, for conviction, and they do it for principles, actually. So I started a conference 2 years ago.
Truth Tellers.
Yes, called Truth Tellers, which is in honor of my late great husband, who was a fantastic journalist, Sir Harold Evans, who was a big, brilliant crusading editor of the Sunday Times, who campaigned for 10 years to get compensation for the thalidomide victims, and really was a great leader in terms of courageous investigations. And at Truth Tellers, we bring together these journalists to really strengthen the bonds of journalism, to make people... I mean, journalism is such a demoralized profession that we have to support journalists, because without them, there's going to be no resistance.
Yeah. One of the reasons we've ended up here with, billionaire owners of important media outlets like the LA Times, like the Washington Post, is because of the state of the business of media.
Right.
And you've had a front row seat to the shift, starting in the print world, moving to the Daily Beast, a digital publication. I mean, what's your assessment around the business model of media, and how much just the lack of a sustainable business model has compromised the ability for media to be independent, because they have to be reliant on...
Precisely.
Yeah.
You cannot be brave if there's nobody supporting you. And in my husband's day at the Sunday Times, the Thompson family were very supportive of strong media, and indeed Thompson still is with Reuters. Well, I think it's an enraging tragedy what has happened to media. I think in the early 2000s, traditional media was far too passive in the face of digital disruption. And they essentially were so excited at the idea of, they were going to get lots of traffic from digital sites that they sort of allowed content to be stolen, essentially. I mean, content was taken free, not paid for, and of course, they did not benefit from it. It was the tech companies that monetized that stolen intellectual property, which is what it was. And
they're doing it again with AI, by the way.
Well, now, 20 years later, 25 years later, we see it happening all over again. Those self-same people who, robbed this profession and killed it, certainly brought it to its knees, are coming back, those very same companies, and are now saying, now we want to have scrape all your content for AI. And, we might, and companies are fighting back, and they might get like a 250 million or something, but that's nothing when you consider the fortunes that are being made by the tech companies off the back of other people's brains. And I do not know why, writing sentences is not valued more than writing code, because it lasts longer, that's for sure. I mean, one Shakespeare sonnet, I'm sorry, but beat that algorithm,
I love that. What you're saying makes a lot of sense, because even I'd say the most independent newspaper in America, the New York Times, that has, is a publicly traded company, has, I think, 11 million subscribers. If you think of 11 million subscribers, I think most of them are in the United States, out of a total of 350 million people. Like, undeniably, the influence of traditional media has waned with the rise of social media.
Indeed.
Right? I'm curious about what you make of the prospects of your old stomping grounds at Condé Nast or Hearst, where you were once offered a job. What do you think is the future of these print magazines, still highly reliant on advertising models, haven't managed to transition to the digital space in a way that's sustainable from a business standpoint?
Unfortunately, I think that they are going to go into the dank graveyard of empire. Magazines, which I love the art of magazines, I love the craft of magazines, I love the feel of magazines, but I don't read magazines anymore.
Even you?
No, I don't read any. I read on my phone, like most people, or, I follow, journalists' feeds, and I get my news from this kind of huge sort of smorgasbord of various sources. I do not buy magazines anymore. So I don't think that the magazines have a future, unfortunately, which grieves me, but I'm being frank. I mean, I don't think they have. Somehow I've gone beyond caring about that. I did care about that, but I don't care about it anymore. All I care about, I don't care what form it comes in. We have to be able to sustain, nourish, nurture, and find an audience for serious investigative news, because without it, we are completely screwed, quite honestly. Because there's just nothing else that's going to be able to fight back against, autocratic dictators, against, the sort of debasement of the culture in general, against lies and misinformation. I mean, it's just stunning what garbage just kind of percolates through people's minds all the time with this, and they don't know or care whether it's true or not. It's almost as if people have gone beyond caring, literally, whether what they read is true or not. And it's a very, I think, the most alarming thing, frankly, about society, because I think it's much the most serious problem. It's more serious than anything, is the death of truth, essentially, and what that can do to, a society. So I spend a lot of my time thinking about this.
Well, I happen to agree with you, which is why I do the work that I do. I am also aligned with you that the medium doesn't matter, What matters is that we have really thoughtful, curious, truth-telling people in the roles of editors and journalists of the media. So I'm curious, maybe to get a little bit of your advice as a newbie editor or a newer editor. Like, what do you think makes a good editor today?
Well, I think it's the same things that have always made a good editor. First of all, you have to be absolutely curious. Secondly, you have to do what Daniel was talking about, colliding, how he actually put it, he put it very well, sort of colliding with the different, being willing to be alive and open to all of these different perspectives, points of view, and information. And understanding, how to get that work out of people. Because, very often you have to sort of pull this work from people in a way that, is a very sort of intimate process, as it is within a director and an actor. And I think one of the sad things now about editing is that there's very little nourishing of writers and journalists by editors, simply because they don't have them. I've actually launched, as part of this foundation I've launched for my husband's journalism fund, we now give an annual fellowship to a young investigative journalist who is rewarded by going to work for 9 months at Reuters in their investigative department. And I'm stunned by the entries, quite honestly, because last time we got like about 800 entries from these brilliant young investigative journalists.
For one spot.
For one spot. And the refrain in all of their submissions was they are alone, they have no one to mentor them or talk to them about their stories, they're sitting in their apartments, somehow supported by a few non-profit dollars here and there, trying to do their investigative work in the face of, intimidation and no backing. And they go to foreign parts of the world that are wildly dangerous without any kind of institutional backing. So you're seeing all of these journalists. I mean, I think there's 178 have been killed in the Middle Eastern, in the Israeli-Hamas wars. They're dying. They're not protected. They're locked up. They're being imprisoned, as Evan Gorevich was. I mean, they're risking the most extraordinary amount to try to get the stories out, to try to get the truth out. And they're doing it without the institutional backing that they used to have, in the days, for instance, when my husband was editor at the Sunday Times. So, when I read these entries, it sort of breaks my heart, because, you could staff an entire brilliant newsroom with these kids. And then entries are coming from, Eastern Europe and India and Nigeria and all of these terrific reporters. And, I just think, where are they going to go, these people? How will they apply their trade? Where do they apply to? And I talk at the journalism schools, and people go like, well, if you were me, where would you apply to be a journalist? And it's hard to know how they can make a living, really.
Yeah.
But they do, and that's what I love about them. They find ways to do it. So I think we're really going to be dependent more and more on non-profits. We have to, I would actually, talking about tariffs, I would actually force all the digital, if I was queen, if I was president, I would force the tech companies to sort of bloody well tithe, the huge amounts of what they have.
They did that for a while to support all sorts of initiatives, and then they removed the tithe, and then all those companies shut down.
That was just pure PR, and it was all just greenwashing and baloney. Their natural instincts is to be predators.
Okay.
And it's only going to get worse.
Before we run out of time...
So nice to have so many tech people in the room.
Before we run out of time, I did want to talk a little bit about your experiences in leadership. We heard the most inspiring talk from Nemonte Nkimo right now, who talked about the roles of women in leadership. And I read some pretty outrageous stories of some of the things that you experienced in moving up the ranks at Condé Nast in your career. Looking back now, do you think, one, what advice do you have for women who are looking to have an impact in the world like you have? And two, how much has really changed, do you think, for women leaders? We've just seen the second Democratic candidate as a woman who's lost, in the context of that as well. What's your reflection on female leadership?
It's actually disheartening, in fact. On my way up, I was so focused on the actual job at hand that I can only say that, how do you get through it? You get through it by winning, right? You get through it by succeeding and focusing like a Japanese bullet train on where you want to go. But as I look back, I just see how demeaned I so often was, even at Condé Nast, which frankly the chairman Cy Newhouse, you could not have a better boss. I mean, for 17 years he supported me, he gave me Vanity Fair, he gave me the New Yorker, he kept promoting me. But he would always exclude me from any of the serious, what I call business discussions about my enterprise. I mean, I was literally treated as a sort of fluffy-haired rockette or something, where I was sort of not asked to the big boys' table. And yet it was my magazine, and I had, I'd created all of this success, but somehow I was never consulted. I mean, he would appoint, for instance, the publisher, who was my opposite number selling advertising. I mean, he would just call me on a Tuesday and say, "You've got a new publisher." It's like, well, don't you want to at least ask me, is this the right guy for the job?
Yeah.
Which it wasn't, mostly. And
it was a guy usually, right?
Oh, yes, it was always a guy. I mean, the New Yorker was the worst, but anyhow. But it was very sort of vexing, and it was why I left, actually. It was why I left Condé Nast.
But wait, even before you left, I read somewhere or watched a video or something that you went 14 years without a raise?
Yeah,
and you only got a raise when you were offered a job at Hearst?
I was offered a job at Hearst, and, it's partly my fault because women tend to have this terrible, sort of, self-deprecating because we've been, stomped on so many times in this way that we don't go in with the same kind of confidence that men do to demand a raise. And so every sort of, Cy would give me, 10,000 and say, Happy Christmas. And I would say, oh, thank you so much. I'm so grateful. And I think, wait a minute, I just took this magazine from like the bottom of the pit to like #1 on the hot list, And eventually, I was offered this other job. And so they had real leverage. And that was a point where I went to this very big sort of super agent, as he was known. And I decided I could not have the conversation. And he went in, and in 10 minutes, I was suddenly owning $1 million. That's it.
Wow.
Absolutely. I got like a $500,000 raise, in 10 minutes. I mean, because he went to take Cy Newhouse for breakfast, and I was sitting there thinking, it was 8 o'clock. I got the call at 8:15. So, I realized I had all of this leverage, but I had never sort of actually used it. And one of the things that kind of sort of energized me to do that was when I discovered that the editor of GQ, who frankly was this kind of B-list bro, with a beard, was earning more than I was, and why? There was absolutely no reason whatever, but it's just this gendered thing, and it is true. And my daughter is a wonderfully sort of dynamic documentary producer, but I during COVID I would listen to the Zooms, right, and it's the same old story. The guys are all just like talking over her, sort of constantly, even though she was in fact, sort of in a higher position than many of them, you'll be like, Izzy, will you get that done? Like, Izzy, will you, like, talking to her, they were always like passing the grunt work to her, and I suddenly thought, this is just what happens all the time, is this kind of constant making women just sort of be the sort of the also-ran. And you have to be quite aggressive, which I've now become. Now I'm old and I don't care, and I can mouth off and I can say what I like, and who cares, because media's collapsed anyway. So, I'm probably talking to 10 people, the same size as my Christmas list, But that's also quite liberating.
So do you think, if it was your opportunity again, would you use that bullet train approach? And would you advise, you talked about bullet train, you talked about getting leverage, you talked about getting an agent. Is that your advice for...
Well, next time I think I'd get a howitzer, actually. I'd like to feel that I could stomp in and just do it, I don't know. I see the younger generation having the same issue, which actually does worry me. And I am... it has bummed me out that, the trouble is that very often, because of the system and so on, then the wrong person will be chosen. I was really rooting for Kamala, obviously, like everyone who didn't want Trump to win, but she wasn't the best candidate,
And she was the better candidate, you think?
Was she the better candidate? That's quite a long conversation.
Okay.
You know?
We'll do it over another
Another
time.
one.
Tina Brown.
So much fun to talk to you, Imran.
Thank you very much.
And congratulations on what you have created.
That was quite a tour. Were you happy? Yeah? That brings us to the end of The Wider World at BOF Voices 2024. Please, if you share your videos and photos and feedback, please use the hashtag BOF Voices. For everyone watching online, we look forward to seeing you tomorrow. Our programming will begin at 10:30 a.m. London time, 5:30 a.m. New York time with the Fashion System. And we'll start with our findings from the 9th edition of the Status Fashion Report. Thank you for tuning in, and we look forward to welcoming you back tomorrow. So long from Oxfordshire.